Dorothy Mae Caldwell had spent 48 years building a life with a man who, in the end, decided that life was something he could simply walk away from and take with him when he left. She had given him her youth, her energy, her patience, and her faith, and on a bright Monday morning in April, sitting across from him in a courtroom in Wythe County, Virginia, she watched him sign his name to the document that declared all of it finished. He did not look at her when he signed. He had stopped looking at her approximately 2 years earlier, around the time a woman named Janine Cross began answering his phone on Saturday afternoons. Dorothy was 76 years old. She had married Earl Raymond Caldwell when she was 28 and he was 30, a tall quiet man who worked as a foreman at the lumber mill outside of town and who had courted her with the slow deliberate patience of a man who understood that some things worth having could not be rushed. She had believed that patience was who he was. She had been wrong about that, or perhaps she had been right about it for a long time and then the thing she was right about had simply changed, the way people change when they decide that the life they built is smaller than the life they believe they still deserve. The divorce had not been Dorothy's idea. It had not been her choice, her preference, or anything she had seen coming until it was already too late to prevent. Earl had announced his intention to leave on a Thursday evening in November, standing in the kitchen of the house they had shared for 44 years, wearing his good boots and the expression of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say enough times that the words had lost whatever weight they might have originally carried. He told her he had met someone. He told her he was sorry. He told her that he still cared about her deeply but that he needed to be honest with himself about what he wanted from whatever years he had left. He was 78 years old and he spoke about his remaining years as if they were a commodity he had been poorly investing and needed to redirect before the market closed entirely. Dorothy had stood at the kitchen counter with a dish towel in her hands and listened to every word without interrupting. When he finished, she folded the towel precisely, set it on the counter beside the sink, and asked him one question. "How long?" Earl had the decency to look uncomfortable. 2 years, he said. "Give or take?" 2 years. Dorothy absorbed that the way you absorb a blow you did not see coming, not all at once but in waves, each one arriving slightly after you thought you had already felt the worst of it. 2 years of phone calls she had not questioned. 2 years of Saturday afternoons he had spent somewhere other than where he said he was. 2 years of evenings when he had sat across from her at the dinner table and spoken to her in the same voice he had always used, the same steady unhurried voice she had fallen in love with at 28, while carrying a secret that made every word he said to her during those 2 years a form of theater performed for an audience of one. She did not cry in front of him. She had learned across 48 years of marriage that Earl interpreted tears as a problem to be solved rather than an emotion to be witnessed, and she did not want to be solved. She wanted to be left alone with whatever remained of her dignity, which at that moment felt like a very thin and fragile thing balanced on the edge of something she could not quite see. Earl moved out the following weekend into an apartment in Wytheville that Dorothy suspected had been arranged well in advance of his Thursday evening announcement. He took his clothes, his tools, his fishing equipment, and a framed photograph of his mother that had hung in the hallway for as long as Dorothy could remember. He did not take any photographs that included her. The divorce proceedings lasted 7 months. Earl had retained an attorney named Price from a firm in Roanoke whose reputation for aggressive asset acquisition preceded him into every room he entered. Dorothy had retained a local attorney named Willard Combs, a semi-retired man in his early 70s who operated out of a small office above the hardware store on Main Street and who had handled her mother's estate 15 years earlier. Willard was kind, competent, and entirely outmatched by the machinery Earl had set in motion. The house, the one Dorothy had lived in for 44 years, was in Earl's name. He had insisted on that when they purchased it in 1980, explaining that it was simpler for financing purposes, and Dorothy had agreed because she had trusted him and because in 1980 it had not occurred to her that she would ever need legal protection from the man she had married. The savings accounts, also in Earl's name, or in joint accounts he had systematically drained over the preceding 18 months in transfers she had not noticed until Willard began requesting financial disclosures. The truck, Earl's. The life insurance policies, restructured 2 years ago with Janine Cross listed as primary beneficiary, a detail that arrived in the discovery documents with the quiet devastating force of something that had been planned long before the Thursday evening announcement. What Dorothy received in the final settlement was the product of 7 months of legal argument reduced to a single paragraph in a document that felt like it had been written by someone who had never met her. A lump sum of $34,000 representing her share of the marital assets after Earl's attorney had finished classifying, reclassifying, and strategically depreciating everything they had accumulated across 5 decades of shared life. $34,000. 48 years divided by the number of ways a good attorney can make a marriage disappear from a balance sheet. And one additional item, listed almost as an afterthought in the final paragraph of the settlement agreement. The property located at 14 Sycamore Hollow Road in the unincorporated community of Allisonia, Pulaski County, Virginia, consisting of approximately 11 acres of unimproved land and structures thereon, assessed value $28,000, awarded to Dorothy Mae Caldwell as her separate property free and clear of any claim by the opposing party. Sycamore Hollow Road. Dorothy read the address and felt something move through her that was not quite memory and not quite grief but lived somewhere in the territory between them. 14 Sycamore Hollow Road was her father's land. The old Marsh homestead where she had grown up, where her father Harlan Marsh had lived and worked and died in 1949 when Dorothy was 3 years old. It had passed to her mother, then to Dorothy upon her mother's death in 2009, and had sat empty and untended ever since, a small stone farmhouse on 11 acres of overgrown hollow land at the end of a gravel road that most people in the county had forgotten existed. Earl had never wanted anything to do with it. He had visited the property exactly twice during their marriage, both times under protest, and had described it on the second visit as a waste of acreage that would cost more to clear than it would ever be worth. When his attorney included it in Dorothy's settlement, it was not an act of generosity. It was an act of disposal. They were giving her the one thing they considered worthless enough to part with without argument. Dorothy's children, Michael and Sandra, had not spoken to her since the divorce was finalized. This was the part that cut deepest, deeper than Earl's betrayal, deeper than the financial devastation, deeper than the public humiliation of being left at 76 by a man she had loved since she was young enough to believe that love was a permanent condition. Michael was 46, an insurance adjuster in Richmond who had always been closer to his father than to her, not through any failure of Dorothy's affection but through the particular gravity that sometimes pulls sons toward fathers in ways that cannot be redirected by effort or intention. Sandra was 43, a real estate agent in Roanoke who had inherited Earl's talent for calculating value and applying it to situations where value was not the most relevant metric. When the divorce proceedings began, Dorothy had expected her children to be hurt, confused, perhaps angry at Earl for fracturing the family they had all shared. She had not expected them to choose sides with the swift uncomplicated efficiency of people who had already been calculating which parent represented the better investment. Michael had called her once, 3 weeks after Earl moved out, and spoken for approximately 12 minutes in the careful measured tones of a man delivering a prepared statement. He told her that he understood this was difficult but that he had to respect his father's right to pursue happiness. He told her that he hoped she would not make things contentious. He told her that Janine was actually a very nice person once you got to know her. Dorothy had listened to all of it and when he finished she had said simply, "I am your mother, Michael. I have been your mother for 46 years. The silence that followed was long enough that she understood he had nothing to say to that, not because he disagreed but because he had not prepared a response for a statement that did not require argument, only acknowledgement. Sandra had not called at all. She had sent a text message, brief and composed, explaining that she thought it was best if she maintained a neutral position during the proceedings and that she hoped Dorothy would understand. Neutral. As if the dissolution of her parents' marriage were a business dispute requiring diplomatic distance rather than a crisis in which her mother might need to hear her daughter's voice. Dorothy had understood, in the way that mothers eventually understand all the things their children do not say aloud, that Michael and Sandra had made a financial calculation. Earl had the house, the accounts, the investments, the truck, the life insurance, the earning history, and the future with Janine that promised stability and continued access to resources. Dorothy had $34,000 and 11 acres of nothing in a hollow no one visited. The math was simple. The cruelty of it was that the math was not wrong. Willard Combs had sat across from Dorothy in his small office above the hardware store on the afternoon the settlement was finalized and looked at her with an expression she recognized as the particular helplessness of a decent man who knows he has failed someone he wanted to help. "I'm sorry, Dorothy. I wish I could have done more." "You did what you could, Willard." She meant it. He had worked hard and charged her almost nothing, and the outcome had been determined long before either of them sat down at the table. Earl had planned this for 2 years. You do not spend 2 years planning something unless you intend for the result to be decisive. Dorothy drove back to the house that was no longer hers on the afternoon the settlement was finalized and spent 3 days packing 48 years of her life into the back of a borrowed station wagon that belonged to her neighbor Helen Prater. Helen was 71, a retired school bus driver who lived alone in a small house at the end of the street and who had appeared on Dorothy's porch the morning after Earl moved out with a casserole, a bottle of wine, and the simple declarative statement that she was available for whatever Dorothy needed and would remain available until Dorothy told her to stop. Helen had not stopped. She had driven Dorothy to attorney appointments, helped her organize financial documents, sat with her on evenings when the house felt too large and too quiet, and had now lent her the station wagon without being asked, understanding through the particular intuition of women who have known loss that Dorothy would not have asked for it herself. 3 days of packing. Dorothy moved through rooms she had occupied for 44 years and selected what to take with the ruthless efficiency of someone who has learned that sentiment is a luxury she could no longer afford. Clothing, practical and sufficient. Photographs from before her marriage, her parents, her childhood, her mother's garden. A small wooden jewelry box that had belonged to her grandmother. 4 boxes of books. Kitchen essentials, enough to function, not enough to replicate the kitchen she was leaving behind. Her mother's Bible, worn soft with use, with a family tree written in fading ink on the inside front cover that traced the Marsh family back to 1843 and the hollow that still bore their name on county maps no one consulted anymore. She did not take anything Earl had given her during their marriage. Not the anniversary necklace, not the Christmas china, not the framed watercolor of the Blue Ridge he had bought her at a craft fair in Floyd County 20 years ago. She left all of it arranged precisely where it had always been, as if the house were a museum of a marriage that had existed and the artifacts belonged to the building rather than to her. On the morning she left, Helen Prater stood in the driveway and watched her load the last box into the station wagon with the composed steadiness of a woman who had decided that breaking down was something she would do later, somewhere private, on her own terms. Helen handed her a thermos of coffee and a paper bag containing 2 sandwiches. "For the drive." "It's only 40 minutes, Helen." Helen looked at her with the particular directness of a woman who has stopped pretending that practical gestures are about practicality. "I know how long the drive is." "Take the sandwiches." Dorothy took the sandwiches. She hugged Helen for a long time without speaking, got into the borrowed station wagon, and drove away from the house on Prospect Street without looking back. She had become very good at not looking back. 48 years of practice. The drive to Allisonia took 38 minutes through countryside Dorothy had known her entire life but had not traveled in years. The road wound south and west through the kind of Virginia landscape that postcards never quite captured accurately, rolling green hills giving way to steeper terrain as the New River Valley narrowed and the mountains closed in on both sides with the patient geological authority of formations that had been there long before anyone thought to build roads through them. She passed through the small communities that dotted the route, places with names that sounded like they had been chosen by people who valued description over poetry. Rural retreat. Allisonia itself was barely a community at all, a scattering of houses and farms along a 2-lane road that followed the river, connected by the kind of mutual awareness that exists in places where everyone knows everyone and has for generations. Sycamore Hollow Road branched off the main road just past a small white church and climbed gradually into the hills through stands of hardwood forest that had been growing undisturbed for longer than Dorothy had been alive. The road was gravel, poorly maintained, with grass encroaching from both shoulders and the occasional branch hanging low enough to brush the roof of the station wagon as she passed beneath it. She had driven this road thousands of times as a child, riding beside her mother in the front seat of a truck that smelled like engine oil and the particular sweetness of cut hay. The road had been better maintained then. Everything had been better maintained then, when the hollow had still been a living place rather than a forgotten one. She almost missed the turn onto the property itself. The entrance was marked by 2 stone posts her father had set in 1941, the year he bought the land, but the posts were nearly invisible now beneath decades of wild grape and Virginia creeper that had claimed them with the slow irreversible patience of things that grow without anyone watching. Dorothy stopped the station wagon between the posts and sat for a moment with the engine idling, looking up the overgrown drive toward what she could see of the house through the trees. She could not see much. The canopy had closed overhead in the years since her last visit, creating a green tunnel effect that obscured everything beyond the first 50 feet of the drive. She took a breath, put the station wagon in gear, and drove forward into the tunnel of trees toward whatever waited for her at the end of a road she had not traveled in 15 years and a life she had not imagined she would ever need to return to. The house emerged from the trees the way old houses in hollows tend to emerge, gradually, as if the forest were reluctantly parting to reveal something it had been holding on to. It was a stone farmhouse, small by any standard, built by her grandfather Amos Marsh in 1921 from fieldstone quarried on the property itself. 2 stories, though the second story was little more than an attic with dormer windows that her mother had used as sewing rooms. A covered front porch running the width of the house, supported by square timber posts her father had replaced in the summer of 1947, 2 years before he died. A chimney at each end, both built from the same gray fieldstone as the walls, both showing the effects of 70 years without maintenance but still standing, still structurally sound in the way that things built from local stone by people who understood local stone tend to remain. Dorothy parked the station wagon in what had once been the yard and stepped out into a silence so complete it felt physical. No traffic noise, no neighbors, no mechanical hum of any kind. Only the sound of wind moving through the hardwood canopy above her and, somewhere nearby, the quiet continuous conversation of a creek she could hear but could not yet see. She stood beside the car for a long time, her hands at her sides, looking at the house where she had been born, where she had spent the first 3 years of her life before her father died and her mother moved them both to town. It was smaller than she remembered, the way childhood places always are when you return to them as an adult, but it was still standing. It had been standing for over 100 years and it showed no particular interest in stopping. The front porch steps were sound, though the boards needed replacing in 2 places where moisture had done its patient invisible work. The front door was unlocked. Her mother had never locked it. There was nothing inside worth stealing, her mother had always said, and anyone who came this far up the hollow looking for something probably needed whatever they found more than she did. Inside, the house smelled the way unoccupied houses smell after years of standing empty. Dust, old wood, the faint mineral scent of stone walls that have been breathing on their own for a long time. But beneath those smells, something else, something Dorothy recognized immediately and felt in her chest before she could name it. Her mother's house. The particular combination of wood polish and dried herbs and something indefinable that was simply the smell of the woman who had lived here, still present in the walls and the floorboards and the air itself after all these years, the way a person's presence lingers in a space long after the person is gone. Dorothy set her bags down in the front room and walked through the house slowly, room by room, reacquainting herself with dimensions and doorways and the particular way the afternoon light came through the west-facing kitchen window and laid a warm rectangle across the stone floor. The kitchen was intact, though dusty. The wood stove her mother had cooked on until 2004, when Dorothy had finally convinced her to accept a propane range, still stood in its alcove. The oak table where Dorothy had eaten breakfast every morning of her childhood still occupied the center of the room, solid and patient and entirely unimpressed by the passage of time. She ran her hand across its surface and felt the familiar grain beneath her fingers, and for the first time since the courthouse, for the first time since Earl's Thursday evening announcement, for the first time in what felt like years rather than months, she felt something that was not fear or anger or grief. She felt the floor beneath her feet. She felt the walls around her. She felt the particular steadiness of a place that had been built to last by people who understood what lasting meant, and she understood, standing in her dead mother's kitchen at the age of 76 with $34,000 and a borrowed station wagon and absolutely nothing else, that she had not come here to hide. She had come here to begin. She slept that first night in her mother's bedroom on the second floor, on a mattress she had dragged up from the front room and covered with sheets she had brought from the house on Prospect Street. The room was cold. The propane had been disconnected years ago and the wood stove downstairs needed its flue inspected before she could trust it. She lay beneath 2 blankets and her winter coat and listened to the house settling around her in the dark, the particular creaking and ticking of old timber adjusting to the temperature, sounds she had not heard since childhood but recognized immediately the way you recognize a voice you have not heard in decades. The house was speaking to her in the language of the people who had built it, and she lay still and listened and felt, beneath the cold and the fear and the bone-deep exhaustion of everything that had brought her here, something she had not expected to feel. She felt held. The first weeks were practical and relentless. Dorothy had $34,000, a figure that sounded like something until you began dividing it by the number of things a 76-year-old woman living alone on an unmaintained property in a rural Virginia hollow actually needed. She made a list on the back of an envelope the first morning, sitting at her mother's oak table with coffee she had brewed on a camp stove she found in the pantry. Propane reconnection. Flue inspection. Roof assessment. Well pump servicing. Electrical inspection. Septic evaluation. Groceries. The list filled the envelope and continued on to a second one. She looked at the 2 envelopes side by side and did the math and understood that $34,000 was not a fortune. It was a runway, and the runway was not long. She began with what she could do herself, which turned out to be more than she had expected. Dorothy Mae Caldwell, born Dorothy Mae Marsh, had grown up in this house with a mother who believed that waiting for someone else to fix something was a form of laziness that the Lord did not look favorably upon. Her mother had taught her to repair plaster, replace window glazing, patch a leaking roof with tar and tin, clean a chimney flue with a weighted brush and a rope, and diagnose a malfunctioning well pump by the sound it made when you stood directly above it and listened with your whole body. These were skills Dorothy had not used in decades, skills Earl had never known she possessed because he had never asked and she had never thought to mention them, and now they returned to her hands with the quiet authority of things that had been waiting patiently to be needed again. She cleaned the flue herself on the 3rd day, standing on the roof in her work boots and her mother's canvas jacket, lowering the weighted brush down the chimney with the practiced rhythm her mother had demonstrated when Dorothy was 9 years old. The brush came up black with creosote and old bird nesting, and she cleaned it and sent it down again and again until the bristles came up clean. That evening she built a fire in the wood stove for the first time, and the house filled with warmth that felt like more than temperature. It felt like permission. Permission to be here. Permission to stay. The town of Allisonia took notice of her arrival with the measured curiosity that small communities apply to events that are unexpected but not entirely surprising. A woman returning to a family property after a difficult situation. It was not an unfamiliar story in this part of Virginia, where land and family and loss had been braided together for generations in patterns that repeated themselves with only minor variations. The first person to visit was a man named Curtis Freely, who lived on the adjacent property a quarter-mile down the hollow and who appeared at her porch on the 4th morning carrying a paper bag containing a dozen eggs and a jar of sourwood honey. He was 73 years old, lean and weathered in the way of men who have spent their entire lives outdoors, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same hardwood as the trees surrounding them. "I knew your father," Curtis said, standing on the porch with the paper bag held out in front of him like an offering. "Not well. I was just a boy when he passed. But my father knew him. Worked alongside him at the Caldwell place before the war. Said Harlan Marsh was the most careful man he ever met." Dorothy took the eggs and the honey and invited Curtis inside for coffee, and they sat at the oak table and talked for an hour about the hollow and the people who had lived in it and the particular way that time moved differently in places where the mountains blocked the horizon on every side. Curtis told her that the property had been well regarded in its day. Her father had kept it meticulously. Her mother had maintained it respectably after his death, though she had let certain things go in her later years when her health declined and the hollow grew too quiet for a woman living alone. Certain things. Dorothy asked what he meant by that, and Curtis paused and looked out the kitchen window toward the back of the property with an expression that suggested he was choosing his words with more care than the question seemed to require. "Well," he said slowly, "there is the matter of the smokehouse." Dorothy set down her coffee. The smokehouse. She had not thought about the smokehouse in years, possibly decades. It existed in her memory the way certain childhood landmarks exist, as fixtures of a landscape so familiar they become invisible. A stone structure at the far back of the property, beyond the tree line, set against the base of the hill where the hollow narrowed and the creek bent sharply to the east. Her mother had mentioned it occasionally in the offhand way people mention things they have decided are not worth discussing in detail. Your father's smokehouse. He sealed it up before he died. Nothing in there worth bothering about. Curtis Freely was looking at her with the particular attention of a man who has said something he intended to say and is waiting to see whether it landed where he aimed it. Your father sealed that building in 1948, he said. The year before he passed. My father always wondered about it. Said Harlan spent the better part of that summer working on something back there, hauling materials up the hollow in his truck, working late into the evenings. Wouldn't say what he was doing. Then one day it was done. Locked up. Sealed. He told my father the same thing he apparently told your mother. Nothing in there worth bothering about. Curtis paused. My father never believed that, he said simply. Neither did I. Dorothy thought about that conversation for 3 days. She thought about it while she repaired the porch steps, while she cleaned the kitchen from floor to ceiling, while she reconnected the propane with the help of a technician from town named Dale who charged her half his usual rate and refused to explain why. She thought about it while she lay in bed at night listening to the creek and the wind and the house speaking its patient language of settling timber and breathing stone. She thought about it because something about the phrase "nothing in there worth bothering about" had begun to sound different to her now than it had when her mother said it. It sounded less like a statement of fact and more like a direction. An instruction. A door closed with specific and deliberate intention by a man who had spent the last summer of his life working behind it. On the 7th morning, Dorothy put on her boots and her mother's canvas jacket and walked to the back of the property for the first time since her arrival. The path was barely visible, overgrown with decades of unchecked growth, wild blackberry and honeysuckle and the persistent woody stems of Virginia creeper that had colonized every vertical surface within reach. She pushed through it with the patient determination of a woman who had decided she was going somewhere and did not intend to be discouraged by the route. The tree line swallowed her after 100 yards, and the light changed immediately from open sky to the filtered green gold of a mature hardwood canopy. Oak and hickory and tulip poplar, trees her father had known by name, trees that had been growing here since before his grandfather built the house in 1921. The ground sloped gently downward toward the creek, and she followed the faint trace of the old path along its bank until the hollow narrowed and the creek bent east, and there, set against the base of the hill exactly where her memory had placed it, was the smokehouse. It was larger than she remembered. Stone construction, like the house, but heavier, built from bigger stones set with the thick mortar joints that suggested a man who intended the structure to stand for a very long time. The walls were perhaps 10 feet high, topped with a timber-framed roof that had been covered in standing seam metal, the kind of roofing that lasted generations if it was properly installed, and this had been properly installed. The metal had weathered to a deep reddish-brown patina but showed no signs of failure. No rust holes, no lifted seams, no sagging. Whatever her father had put beneath that roof, he had made certain that weather would not reach it. The door was heavy timber, oak from the look of it, hung on hand-forged iron hinges that had gone black with age but appeared structurally sound. And across the door, secured through 2 iron hasps bolted directly into the stone walls on either side, was a chain. Not a simple padlock and chain arrangement of the kind you might find on a garden shed, but a serious, heavy, deliberately engineered closure. The chain was thick, each length the size of Dorothy's thumb, and it was threaded through the hasps and secured with a padlock that was unlike any padlock Dorothy had ever seen. It was large, brass beneath decades of tarnish, with a keyhole that was shaped differently from modern locks, longer and narrower, designed for a key that would have been made specifically for this lock and no other. But it was what surrounded the door that made Dorothy stand very still for a long moment. The gaps between the door and the stone frame, the spaces where air and light and moisture might have found their way inside, had been sealed. Not with caulk or tar or any temporary material, but with mortar. The same thick mortar that held the walls together had been carefully applied around every edge of the door frame, filling every crack, every gap, every possible point of entry with the same patient thoroughness that characterized everything else about the structure. Her father had not simply locked this building. He had sealed it. He had sealed it the way you seal something you never intend to open again, or the way you seal something you intend to remain sealed until exactly the right person arrives with exactly the right reason to break it open. Dorothy stood in front of the smokehouse for perhaps 15 minutes. She touched the chain. She touched the lock. She pressed her palm flat against the timber door and felt nothing except cold wood and the faint vibration of the wind moving across the metal roof above. She looked at the mortar seal around the door frame and understood that opening this building would require tools, effort, and a commitment to breaking something her father had deliberately closed. She was not ready for that. Not yet. She walked back to the house through the overgrown path and sat at the oak table and drank cold coffee and tried to understand why a man who was dying, a man who knew he was dying, would spend the last productive summer of his life sealing a smokehouse so thoroughly that it would take deliberate force to open it again. She called Helen Prater that evening, not because she needed advice but because she needed to say things out loud to someone who would listen without trying to solve them. Helen listened the way Helen always listened, completely and without interruption, and when Dorothy finished describing the smokehouse and the chain and the mortar seal, Helen was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Your father sealed that building the year before he died," Helen repeated. "And your mother never opened it?" "Never," Dorothy confirmed. "She always said there was nothing in there worth bothering about." "But you don't believe that anymore," Helen said. It was not a question. Dorothy looked out the kitchen window toward the darkening tree line behind which the smokehouse stood locked and sealed and waiting. "No," she said. "I do not believe that anymore." The following week, Dorothy drove to the Pulaski County Courthouse and spent 3 hours in the records office searching for anything related to her father's property. The clerk, a young woman named Tamara who moved through the filing system with the confident efficiency of someone who genuinely enjoyed the archaeology of county records, helped her locate the original deed, filed in 1941, showing Harlan Joseph Marsh as sole owner of 11 acres in the Sycamore Hollow district. She found the property tax records, paid continuously and without interruption from 1941 through 2009, first by her father, then by her mother, then by Dorothy herself until Earl's attorney had assumed control of her financial obligations during the divorce proceedings. She found a survey map from 1943 that showed the property boundaries and the locations of all structures: the house, a chicken coop that no longer existed, a privy that had been demolished sometime in the 1960s, and, at the back of the property against the base of the hill, a structure labeled simply Smokehouse, stone, 1936. The smokehouse had been built 5 years before her father purchased the property. It had been there when he arrived. He had not built it. He had inherited it from the previous owner, a man whose name appeared on the 1936 construction permit as Eustace Allen Marsh. Dorothy stared at the name for a long moment before the connection resolved itself. Eustace Allen Marsh. Her grandfather's brother. Her great-uncle. A man she had never met, who had died before she was born, who had built a stone smokehouse on land that would eventually pass to his nephew and then to his nephew's daughter and then sit locked and sealed for 76 years while the world moved on around it without knowing or caring what was inside. "Tamara," Dorothy said carefully, "is there anything else filed under Eustace Marsh?" Tamara searched with the focused patience of someone who had been asked similar questions before and understood that the answer mattered. She found one additional document, a business registration filed in 1934 for an entity called Marsh Hollow Provisions, listing Eustace Allen Marsh as sole proprietor, with a business address of 14 Sycamore Hollow Road. The nature of business field contained a single word that made Dorothy sit back in her chair and press both hands flat on the table in front of her. The word was curing. Dorothy left the courthouse with photocopies of everything Tamara had found and drove back to Allisonia in a state of concentrated thought that made the 38 minutes pass without her being aware of them. She parked the station wagon in the yard and walked directly to Curtis Freely's house without stopping at her own. Curtis was on his front porch splitting kindling with the unhurried precision of a man who had been splitting kindling in the same spot for 50 years and intended to continue doing so for as long as his arms allowed. He set down the hatchet when he saw her coming and waited. "My father had an uncle," Dorothy said without preamble. "Eustace Marsh. He built the Smokehouse in 1936. He ran a business called Marsh Hollow Provisions." Curtis nodded slowly. He had the expression of a man who was hearing something he already knew but had been waiting for someone else to arrive at on their own. "I know the name," he said. "My father mentioned Eustace a few times. He was a curing man. Meats, mainly. Hams. Had a reputation for it across 3 counties. People came from as far as Roanoke to buy from him." Dorothy looked at Curtis with the focused attention of a woman who was assembling a picture from pieces that had been scattered across decades. "And my father," she said. "What did my father do with the Smokehouse after Eustace died?" Curtis was quiet for a long moment. He looked toward the tree line in the direction of Dorothy's property, toward the back of the hollow where the Smokehouse stood behind its chain and its mortar seal, and when he spoke his voice had dropped into the particular register people use when they are saying something they have been carrying for a long time. "Your father," he said, "spent the summer of 1948 going in and out of that Smokehouse almost every day." "My father watched him from the ridge. Said Harlan was hauling things in, not taking things out. Boxes, crates, heavy things that took him time to manage alone. He worked all summer. Then in September he sealed the door and locked it with that big brass lock and never went near it again. My father asked him once what he'd put in there." Dorothy waited. Curtis met her eyes. "Harlan told my father that he had put away everything that mattered and that the right person would find it at the right time. My father asked him who the right person was. Harlan said he didn't know yet. Said she hadn't been born yet." Dorothy felt something move through her chest that she could not name. She had been born in November of 1948, 2 months after her father sealed the Smokehouse. Harlan Marsh had locked that building in September. His daughter was born in November. He died the following spring, when she was 5 months old, of a heart condition that the doctors said had been progressing for years and that he had almost certainly known about when he spent that summer hauling boxes through the hollow and sealing a door he would never open again. "He did it for me," Dorothy said, and the words came out in a voice she did not entirely recognize as her own. It was quieter than her usual voice, and steadier, and it carried the weight of something that had been waiting 76 years to be understood. Curtis nodded once. "I believe he did," he said. Dorothy walked home through the hollow in the late afternoon light, through the trees her family had lived among for over a century, past the stone house her grandfather had built with his hands, and she stood at the kitchen window and looked toward the back of the property and made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like an arrival. She would open the Smokehouse. Not tomorrow, not eventually, not when she felt ready in some abstract sense that might never arrive. She would open it because her father had sealed it for her 76 years ago, before she was born, before he knew her name, before he knew anything about her except that she was coming and that she would need what he had put inside. She would open it because a man she had never known had loved her before she existed and had spent the last summer of his life making sure she would never be left with nothing. She would open it because Earl had taken everything she had built across 48 years, and her children had chosen his side with the swift efficiency of people calculating returns, and she was standing alone in a hollow in Virginia with $34,000 and a borrowed station wagon and a locked stone building that her dying father had filled with everything that mattered. She would open it because it was hers, and it had always been hers, and she was finally, at 76, exactly the person her father had sealed it for. She began the next morning at first light. Curtis Freely arrived without being asked, carrying a heavy canvas tool bag and a pry bar that looked like it had been forged in the same era as the padlock on the smokehouse door. He did not offer an explanation for his presence. He simply appeared on the path behind her as she walked toward the back of the property and fell into step beside her as if they had arranged this weeks ago and were both simply keeping the appointment. They stood together in front of the sealed door for a moment without speaking. The morning was cold and still, the kind of February stillness that settles into hollows like water filling a bowl, and the smokehouse looked exactly as it had looked every other time Dorothy had stood before it, heavy, patient, sealed with the quiet authority of a man who had meant every ounce of mortar he pressed into those gaps. Curtis handed her a cold chisel and a hammer. "The mortar seal is your call," he said. "I will hold what needs holding and carry what needs carrying, but I will not break what your father sealed. That is yours to do." Dorothy understood. She positioned the chisel at the top corner of the door frame where the mortar met the stone and struck it with the hammer. The sound rang through the hollow like a bell, sharp and clear and oddly ceremonial, and a piece of mortar the size of her palm broke free and fell to the ground at her feet. 76 years of seal broken with a single blow. She struck again. And again. The mortar was old, but it was good, mixed by a man who understood that the things you seal need to stay sealed until the person they are meant for arrives to open them. It did not crumble easily. It required intention. Dorothy provided it. She worked her way around the door frame with the chisel and hammer for the better part of an hour, clearing the mortar from every gap, every seam, every point where her father had pressed the mixture into stone and wood with his bare hands in the summer of 1948 while his unborn daughter grew inside his wife's body in the house just up the hollow. When the last of the mortar was cleared, she set down the chisel and turned her attention to the chain. The brass padlock was heavy in her hands. She examined it closely for the first time, turning it over, studying the keyhole with its unusual narrow shape. She did not have a key. Her mother had never given her a key, had never mentioned a key, had never indicated that a key to the smokehouse existed at all. Dorothy looked at Curtis. He shook his head. "Never saw one," he said. "If Harlan had a key, he either kept it on his person or he hid it somewhere he trusted." Dorothy thought about that. Somewhere he trusted. She thought about her mother's Bible, the one she had packed in the station wagon, the one with the family tree written in fading ink on the inside front cover. She thought about the weight of it, which had always seemed slightly more than a book of that size should weigh. She thought about the way her mother had always handled that Bible with a particular careful reverence that went beyond the spiritual, the way she held it with both hands and set it down slowly and never allowed anyone else to carry it. "Wait here," Dorothy told Curtis, and walked back to the house faster than she had walked anywhere in months. The Bible was in the box of books she had set on the bedroom floor. She picked it up and held it and felt its weight, which was exactly what she had remembered, slightly more than it should be. She opened the front cover and looked at the family tree, the names written in different hands across different generations, Marsh after Marsh reaching back to 1843. She ran her fingers along the inside of the spine and felt nothing unusual. She turned to the back cover and pressed it and felt something shift beneath the end paper, something small and hard and precisely the shape of a narrow brass key. She used a kitchen knife to carefully separate the end paper from the back cover. The key fell into her palm with the weight of something that had been waiting a very long time to be found. It was brass, tarnished nearly black, with a long narrow shaft and a simple two-pronged bit that matched the keyhole of the padlock exactly. Her mother had carried this key in her Bible for decades, possibly since the day Harlan sealed the smokehouse, carrying it to church and back every Sunday, holding it in her hands every evening when she read her daily passage, keeping it close without ever using it, without ever telling Dorothy it was there. Keeping it safe until the right time. Dorothy walked back to the smokehouse with the key in her closed fist and the Bible tucked under her arm. Curtis had not moved. He looked at her hand and at the Bible and at her face and did not need to ask. She inserted the key into the padlock. It turned with the smooth, immediate certainty of a lock that has been waiting for its key, not stiff, not resistant, but ready. The shackle released with a click that sounded, in the silence of the hollow, like the first note of something beginning. Dorothy unwound the chain from the hasps and let it fall to the ground in a heavy coil. She placed both hands flat on the timber door, feeling the cold wood and the grain beneath her palms, and she pushed. The door swung inward on its hand-forged hinges with a low groan that was not protest but announcement, the sound of a sealed space exhaling for the first time in 76 years. The air that came out was cool and dry and carried a smell that Dorothy recognized instantly, deep, rich, complex, the unmistakable smell of cured meat and aged wood and smoke that had been absorbed into stone walls across years of patient use, a smell so dense and layered it was almost a physical presence, as if the air inside the smokehouse had been accumulating character for 3/4 of a century and was now releasing all of it at once. She stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the daylight coming through the open door behind her, and her eyes needed a long moment to adjust. When they did, she understood why her father had spent a summer filling this building and then sealed it with the permanence of a man who intended what he put inside to last. The smokehouse was not large, perhaps 14 feet by 18 feet, with stone walls rising to a vaulted timber ceiling blackened by decades of smoke from the era when it had been used for its original purpose. But every inch of that space had been used. Along the back wall, stacked 3 deep and reaching nearly to the ceiling, were wooden crates. Not rough farm crates, but carefully constructed boxes made from what appeared to be walnut, each one fitted with rope handles and secured with brass clasps that matched the brass of the padlock. They were uniform in size, approximately 2 feet long, 18 inches wide, and a foot deep, and Dorothy counted them quickly and arrived at a number that made her stop counting and simply stare. There were 47 crates against the back wall. Along the left wall, hung from iron hooks driven into the mortar joints between the stones, were hams. Country hams, salt-cured and smoke-finished, hanging in cloth sacks that had yellowed with age but remained intact. Dorothy counted 14 of them. They were dark and dense and shrunken with decades of slow curing, and they filled the left side of the smokehouse with a concentrated, ancient perfume that was unlike anything she had ever smelled, deeper and more complex than any country ham she had encountered in 76 years of living in Virginia. On the right wall, built into the stone itself, were shelves. And on the shelves, arranged with the same meticulous organization that characterized everything in this building, were ceramic jugs. Brown glazed stoneware with cork stoppers sealed in wax, each one marked with a handwritten paper label affixed with twine. Dorothy stepped closer and read the nearest label. Apple Brandy, 1946, EAM. Eustace Allen Marsh. Her great-uncle's initials. She read the next label. Peach Brandy, 1944, EAM. And the next. Corn Whiskey, 1947, Ham. Ham. Harlan Allen Marsh. Her father. Dorothy turned slowly in the center of the smokehouse, taking in the full scope of what surrounded her. 47 walnut crates. 14 aged country hams. Dozens of ceramic jugs of spirits distilled and sealed between 1938 and 1948. A stone building packed floor to ceiling with the accumulated output of 2 generations of Marsh family craft, sealed by her father in the summer before she was born and left untouched for 76 years. Curtis Freely was standing in the doorway. His face, weathered and composed through 7 decades of rural Virginia living, had gone very still. "Dorothy," he said quietly, "do you know what you are looking at?" She shook her head. "Not entirely." Curtis stepped inside and walked to the nearest wooden crate. "May I?" She nodded. He unclasped the brass fittings and lifted the lid. Inside, packed in straw that had dried to a pale gold over the decades, were jars. Mason jars, sealed with wax, each one containing a dark amber liquid. Curtis lifted one carefully and held it up to the light from the doorway. The liquid inside caught the light and threw it back warm and golden, and Curtis exhaled in a way that told Dorothy he understood something she did not yet fully grasp. "This is sorghum," he said. His voice had gone very quiet. "Sorghum molasses. Appalachian sorghum." He looked at her. "My father told me about this. Your great-uncle Eustace and your father Harlan ran one of the finest sorghum operations in Southwest Virginia. They pressed their own cane, cooked it in a copper evaporator, and put it up in glass with the same care most people put into nothing at all. He set the jar down gently. They stopped production in 1948 when your father got sick. My father said the last batches they made were the best they ever produced. Harlan would not sell them. Said he was putting them away. Curtis looked around the smokehouse at the 47 crates stacked against the back wall. 47 crates, he said. At roughly 24 jars per crate. Dorothy did the math. Over 1,000 jars. Over 1,000 jars of artisan Appalachian sorghum molasses, sealed in wax, stored in controlled conditions inside a stone smokehouse that had maintained a cool, constant temperature for 76 years. She sat down on an overturned crate and pressed both hands against her face and breathed very slowly. She did not yet know what this was worth. She knew only that her father, dying and desperate and running out of time, had spent his last able summer packing everything his family had ever made into this building and sealing it for a daughter he would never hold. Everything that mattered, he had told Curtis's father. And now she understood what mattered meant. It meant everything he had built with his hands and his brother's hands, every jar, every jug, every ham, every hour of work that two men had poured into the craft of making things from the land they lived on. He had preserved it all. For her. The authentication process began 10 days later, after Dorothy made a phone call to a woman named Dr. Annette Lawson at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in Richmond, whose name she had found through a chain of referrals that began with the Pulaski County Historical Society and ended with a specialist in Appalachian material culture who had spent her career documenting exactly the kind of artifacts Dorothy was sitting on. Dr. Lawson arrived on a Wednesday morning in a university vehicle accompanied by a graduate assistant named James who carried equipment cases with the reverent caution of someone who understood that what they were about to examine might be significant. Dr. Lawson was 58, a composed woman with reading glasses on a chain and the focused, unhurried energy of someone who had devoted her professional life to objects that other people overlooked. She spent 6 hours inside the smokehouse. She examined the crates, the jars, the ceramic jugs, the hams. She photographed everything with systematic thoroughness. She took samples from 3 jars of sorghum, 2 jugs of brandy, and 1 jug of corn whiskey, sealing each sample in labeled containers with the care of a surgeon handling tissue. When she emerged into the late afternoon light, she stood beside Dorothy on the path and removed her reading glasses and cleaned them slowly, the way people clean their glasses when they are composing something they want to say precisely. Mrs. Caldwell, she said, I have been studying Appalachian foodways and material culture for 27 years. I have examined collections in private homes, institutional archives, and museum holdings across 6 states. I want to tell you plainly what I believe you have in that building. She paused. What your father and your great-uncle preserved in there is one of the most complete and best-preserved collections of pre-1950 Appalachian artisanal food production I have ever encountered. The sorghum alone, if the lab work confirms what I believe about its age and condition, represents a body of work that food historians and collectors have been searching for decades. Properly authenticated heritage sorghum of this age, in original sealed jars, from a documented family operation with provenance records, she gestured toward the business registration Dorothy had found at the courthouse, it is extraordinarily rare. It is the kind of thing that appears on the market once in a generation, if it appears at all. And the spirits? Dorothy asked. Dr. Lawson looked at her. The pre-1950 Appalachian fruit brandy and corn whiskey in original sealed stoneware vessels with maker's marks and dated labels, she said carefully, is in a category that I do not have adequate comparable sales data to price with confidence, because items of this quality and this provenance almost never come to market. What I can tell you is that a single authenticated jug of 1940s Virginia apple brandy sold at auction in Nashville 3 years ago for $14,000. You have, by my preliminary count, 31 jugs. Dorothy sat down on the stone wall beside the path and looked at the smokehouse. 31 jugs. 14 hams that Dr. Lawson described as museum-quality examples of traditional Virginia country ham curing, each one potentially worth thousands to collectors of American food heritage. And over 1,000 jars of sorghum that Dr. Lawson's preliminary estimate placed conservatively at between $300 and $800 per jar depending on authentication results and buyer interest. Dorothy ran the number slowly and arrived at a figure that made the hollow feel very quiet around her. The low-end estimate was $740,000. The high-end estimate, if the authentication confirmed what Dr. Lawson believed and the market responded the way she expected it to, was $1.6 million. From a smokehouse her ex-husband had never once walked to the back of the property to look at. From a building her children had never mentioned, never asked about, never considered for a single moment in their swift and efficient calculation of which parent represented the better investment. The news reached Earl Caldwell through the particular mechanism by which news reaches people in rural Virginia, which is to say it reached him through everyone, gradually and then all at once. Dorothy did not contact him. She did not call Michael or Sandra. She did not make any public announcement of any kind. She simply proceeded, quietly and methodically, with the authentication and appraisal process, working with Dr. Lawson and a specialty auction house in Charlottesville that Dr. Lawson had recommended, a firm called Piedmont Heritage Auctions that handled exactly this kind of historically significant Appalachian material culture. But Allisonia was a small community, and Curtis Freely had a brother-in-law in Wytheville, and Wytheville was where Earl now lived with Janine Cross in the apartment he had rented with money that had once belonged to a marriage that had once belonged to Dorothy. The details traveled the way details travel in small-town Virginia, from kitchen table to church pew to feed store counter, accumulating specificity and emotional weight at every stop, until what arrived at Earl Caldwell's door was not rumor but a fully formed narrative that included dollar figures, expert opinions, and the name of the auction house preparing to handle the sale. Earl called Dorothy on a Sunday evening in April. She was sitting on the front porch of the stone farmhouse watching the last light move through the sycamore trees that gave the hollow its name, and when she saw his name on her phone she looked at it for 3 full rings before answering. Not because she was deciding whether to answer, but because she wanted to hold the moment, the particular moment before she heard his voice for the first time since the courtroom, the moment in which she was entirely herself, sitting on her father's porch, in her father's hollow, with her father's legacy locked and authenticated in the building at the back of the property, owing absolutely nothing to the man whose name was flashing on her screen. She answered. Earl's voice was the same voice it had always been, steady and unhurried, except that now she could hear something beneath the steadiness that she had never heard before, or perhaps had never listened for. Uncertainty. Dorothy, he said. I heard about what you found out there on your father's place. She said nothing. He continued. That is something, he said. That is really something. I had no idea your father had all that back there. She let the silence hold for a moment longer than was comfortable. No, she said. You did not. Another silence. Earl cleared his throat. Dorothy, I want you to know, I think it is wonderful that you have found something of value out there. I truly do. I think your father would be proud. My father, Dorothy said, sealed that building for me before I was born. He spent the last summer of his life filling it with everything his family had ever made, and then he locked it and trusted that I would find it when I needed it. He did that 76 years ago, Earl. He did that without knowing my name. He did that without ever holding me. He did that because that is what love looks like when it is real. She paused. You walked past that property for 48 years. You visited it twice. You called it a waste of acreage. Your attorney put it in my settlement because it was the one thing you considered worthless enough to give away. Earl was quiet. She could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, the particular breathing of a man who was realizing, slowly and with the specific discomfort of irreversible clarity, that the thing he discarded was the thing that mattered most. Dorothy, he began. I have to go, she said. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. With the simple calm finality of a woman who had said what needed to be said and had no interest in hearing what came next. Good night, Earl. She set the phone on the porch railing and watched the last light disappear from the hollow. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel vindication. She felt something quieter than either of those, something closer to completion. The particular settled wholeness of a woman who has been underestimated by everyone she trusted and has discovered, in the place she least expected, that she was never as alone as they made her believe. Michael called 3 days later. His voice sounded different than the last time they spoke, smaller and less rehearsed, as if the prepared statements he relied on had failed him and he was left with nothing but the unpracticed sound of his actual feelings. "Mom," he said. "I heard about Grandpa's smokehouse." "I did not know." "I know you did not know, Michael. That is precisely the point." Sandra sent a text message. Dorothy read it, set the phone down, and did not respond. Some doors, once closed, required more than a text message to reopen. She was willing to wait and see whether Sandra had inherited her grandfather's patience or only her father's talent for calculation. Time would tell. Time, Dorothy had learned, was the one thing that always told the truth eventually. The first auction was held in June at Piedmont Heritage in Charlottesville. 47 lots of authenticated pre-1950 Appalachian sorghum molasses sold for a combined total of $683,000. 12 of the 14 country hams sold for a combined total of $97,000, with the 2 oldest specimens, dated 1938, acquired by the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History for their permanent collection of American food heritage artifacts. The remaining 2 hams were donated by Dorothy to the Virginia Museum of History and Culture at Dr. Lawson's request. The spirits were handled separately through a specialty auction in Nashville that attracted collectors from across the country. The 31 jugs of fruit brandy and corn whiskey, authenticated, dated, and documented with provenance tracing back to the original 1934 business registration of Marsh Hollow Provisions, sold for a combined total of $412,000. The final tally, including the sorghum, the hams, and the spirits, was $1,192,000. Dorothy sat at her mother's oak table on the evening after the final auction and looked at the number written on the settlement sheet and thought about $34,000 and a borrowed station wagon and a courtroom in Wythe County where a man she had loved for 48 years did not look at her when he signed the paper that ended everything she had built. She thought about her father, a man she had never known, who had sealed a stone building for her before she drew her first breath because he understood something about love that Earl had never learned in 78 years of living. She thought about her mother, carrying a brass key in her Bible for decades, holding it every Sunday, keeping it safe without ever using it, trusting that her daughter would find it at the right time. She thought about Curtis freely appearing on the path that morning with his pry bar and his silence, understanding that some doors are not opened alone. She used a portion of the proceeds to restore the smokehouse, preserving it exactly as her father had built it, as a permanent monument to Harlan Marsh and Eustace Marsh and the craft they had practiced in this hollow. She commissioned a small bronze plaque from a metalworker in Floyd County and mounted it beside the door. It read simply, "Marsh Hollow Provisions, EST 1934. Harlan and Eustace Marsh." They put away everything that mattered. She established a fund, managed through Willard Combs's office, to assist elderly women in Pulaski and Wythe counties who were facing displacement through divorce, foreclosure, or family abandonment. She called it the Sealed Door Fund, and she funded it with $200,000 and the instruction that every recipient should be told, when they received help, that it came from a woman who had once been left with nothing and had discovered that nothing was not the end of the story. She kept the property. She did not sell it, not the 11 acres, not the house, not the smokehouse, not a single sycamore tree in the hollow that bore her family's name. She restored the farmhouse with the same patient skill her mother had taught her, replastering walls, repairing windows, rebuilding the garden her mother had let go in her final years. She planted a kitchen garden in the same beds her grandmother had used, following the layout she found sketched in a notebook tucked into a drawer in the pantry, her grandmother's handwriting mapping rows of beans and tomatoes and herbs in the particular careful hand of a woman who understood that growing things was not separate from loving things but was in fact the very same act. On a warm evening in September, 9 months after arriving at Sycamore Hollow with nothing she had expected and everything she would ever need, Dorothy sat on the front porch of the stone farmhouse and watched the light move through the trees the way it had moved through these trees for centuries, gold and amber and slow, the light of a place that had been waiting for her longer than she had been alive. The smokehouse door stood open at the back of the property. She left it open now, every day, the way you leave open something that was sealed for too long by someone who loved you too much to leave you unprotected. She thought about Harlan Marsh, a man she had never met, who had spent his last summer on earth filling a stone building with everything his hands had ever made so that his unborn daughter would never stand empty-handed in a world that was careless with the people it should have cherished. She thought about her mother, steady and quiet and faithful, carrying a key in her Bible for a lifetime without explanation, trusting the timing of things she could not control. She thought about Earl, who had walked past the back acre 1,000 times and never once looked closely enough to see what was there, and she thought about him without anger now, without bitterness, with only the particular clarity that comes from understanding that some people look at land and see acreage and some people look at land and see everything that was ever planted in it, every hand that ever touched it, every hour of love that soaked into its soil and waited there, patient and silent and permanent, for the person it was meant for. Dorothy Mae Caldwell was 76 years old. She had been left with nothing by a man who had shared her life for 48 years, abandoned by children who had calculated her worth and found it insufficient, and delivered to the doorstep of a stone farmhouse in a hollow that the world had forgotten. And there, behind a rusted chain and a brass padlock and 76 years of mortar and patience and faith, her father had left her everything. Not money, though the money had come. Not security, though the security had followed. He had left her proof, physical, tangible, sealed in stone proof, that she had been loved before she existed by a man who understood that the truest things we build are the things we build for people who have not yet arrived to receive them. The smokehouse door was open. The hollow was quiet. The light moved through the sycamores and touched the stone walls of the house her grandfather had built and the path her father had walked and the porch where Dorothy sat with her hands folded in her lap and her face turned toward the evening and her life, at last, entirely her own. She was just getting started. Thank you so much for staying until the very end. Stories like this one remind us that the most important doors have not been opened yet. If this moved you, there are more stories waiting for you on your screen right now. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. I do not want you to miss what is coming. See you in the next story.